I'm Harley Smith, and welcome to the Master Growers course. Today we're going to be talking about light recipes. Light is the limiting factor for plant growth. You could have the best fertilizer in the world, perfectly balanced, right to the parts per million. You could have the most expensive biostimulants available to man, extracts from microorganisms, from plant growth promoting rhizobacteria and mycorrhizal fungi. But if you don't have the right quantity, quality, and duration of light, plants aren't going to reach their true genetic potential. So today we're going to be looking at light recipes, giving the plant the right light at the right time. Plants need full spectrum light. They need the blue end of the spectrum, and they need the red end of the spectrum. During the vegetative growth stage, plants prefer the blue end of the spectrum. Why? Plants have evolved to compete for the light. If they don't see the sky, if they're in the shade, they start to stretch to get above the other plants in the canopy or lean toward a break in the canopy. But once plants receive enough of the blue part of the spectrum, once they see the sky, they stop stretching. So when we're doing our growing, especially during vegetative growth stage, we want full spectrum light that includes plenty of blue. If you do, the plants will be short and stocky, they'll have thicker stems, they'll have more dark green foliage because blue stimulates chlorophyll production more than any other color in the rainbow. Also, with plenty of blue light and the right intensity, the cuticle cells, that's the waxy covering on the leaves, it'll be thicker, so the plant will be more drought tolerant or disease resistant. And if you looked at the stomata, looked at the leaves under a microscope, the pores that take in carbon dioxide, if you have the right quality of light, there'll be more of them. They'll be denser, closer together. In other words, it turns the plant into a photosynthesis machine. So the red end of the spectrum and the blue end of the spectrum are important for photosynthesis, but also for photomorphogenesis, the shape and the growth habits of the plant. There's another spectrum, though, that's not involved with photosynthesis, at least not directly, but very important to the plant, and that's the 460 nanometer wavelength. As a coincidence, that's sky blue. The sky is mostly 460 to 470 nanometers in wavelength. You know where a plant leans toward the light? That's called phototropism. You put it on the windowsill, it leans toward the light. You turn it around, come back the next day, it's leaning toward the light. Well, plants aren't actually leaning toward the light. They're only leaning toward that blue end of the spectrum at a very narrow wavelength, about the 460 nanometer wavelength. So if you have a horticultural grow light, you want to make sure that it's enhanced in the blue so that the plants can stay short and stocky and have a better growth habit. Plants also need the red end of the spectrum. For photosynthesis, it's very efficient for changing the energy of light, the photons, into chemical reactions through photosynthesis. So the red end is very important for that, but it's also very important during the generative, the fruiting and flowering stage. And that's because plants measure their age from dusk to dusk. When you look at the sunset, what do you see? Reds and oranges. But as the sun goes below the horizon, there are proportionally more far reds. And the plant has sensors in them called phytochromes that sense the red end of the spectrum or the far red spectrum. So as the sun goes down, the plant shuts down for the night. It knows another day has gone by. It's a day closer to the end of its life. So it wants to be conditioned to make more flowers, to make seeds, so that the genes are saved for the next generation. So we want to make sure we have plenty of reds and far reds to increase the production of the plant during the fruit and flower stage. So if you're going to be investing in a grow room or in a greenhouse, one of the best places you can spend your money is on horticultural grow lamps. As an indoor grower, you want to purchase the best quality grow lamps that you can afford. Now, if you're a beginner, though, I have a few words of advice. Don't try to grow a lot of plants in a small space when you're first getting started. You want to have a light that's suitable for the area you're growing in. A 400-watt light will cover about a 3x3 or a 4x4 area. So if you're just getting started, bring in a horticultural grow light that has the red and the blue end of the spectrum. Keep it about 1 foot to 1.5 feet above the growing tips. And then simply raise the light as the plants grow. It's that easy. Remember, too, that light falls off exponentially with distance. At 2 feet above the plant, 2 squared, it's 1/4 the light of at 1 foot. So it's not half the light, it's 1/4. At 3 feet above the plant, it's 1/9 the light of 1 foot. So you get the idea. The further from the plant, there's an exponential fall off of light. At 4 feet above the plant, what would it be? 1/16 the light of 1 foot away. So it's better to keep a single source light close to the plant and raise it as the plants grow. It'll be more intense and you won't burn your plants. If it gets too close, then it could be excess heat that the plant can't handle, and then you could start to get burning of the edges of the leaves. So find the distance that's close enough to the plant to get the intensity that you're looking for, but far enough away so you don't overheat your plant. Now, there is a benefit to using multiple lights instead of a single light source. If you have 2 lights, the cone of light where the light crosses from one light to the other, it makes up for the exponential fall off of light. That's why in a greenhouse you don't see the lights really close to the plants. They're on a grid. They're on centers a certain length apart. Now, if you're growing in a greenhouse, you could put 1,000-watt lights on 10-foot centers, and it would be plenty of crossover light for the plant. Another thing to think about with the intensity of the light is don't overcrowd your plants. That's a very common mistake that beginners make. They want to pile in as many plants as they can into the small area. But this is what happens. Remember, you have a light. As the light's shining through the leaves, the plant's harvesting the red end of the spectrum and the blue end of the spectrum for photosynthesis. The green part of the spectrum is transmitted through the leaves or being reflected. That's why plants look green when we see them, because they're reflecting the green. But green affects the plants as well. If their plants are in the shade, leaves are in the shade because they're overcrowded, plants will sense the green light, and that stimulates the plant to close the stomata, the pores that bring in CO2. So if that happens, it's good plant in nature. They close those bottom leaf stomata. The water can go all the way from the bottom of the plant to the top of the plant where it's needed the most for photosynthesis and to cool the canopy. But less of the canopy becomes photosynthetically active. So make sure that you start to have enough room so that you have good airflow through the canopy and that the leaves aren't crossing over each other like a jungle. Not only will it shut down the photosynthesis of the plant, but it also sets up an environment for powdery mildew and for molds, because you have a microclimate with high humidity because they can't transpire enough. They can't blow away the excess moisture. Now, in some of the commercial greenhouses, light costs money to use artificial lighting. So they want to maximize the amount of light in their greenhouse as well. So one of the rose house greenhouses that I went to in the Netherlands, they didn't even have aisles between the roses. They literally had them crowded together. Someone would push a button. The whole row of roses would come out to the grower. They could do the pruning and trimming, push another button, the row goes back, the next row would come out to them. Because they didn't have aisles, you have an aisle that's just wasted light because the plant is just reflecting off a path. But because they didn't have aisles between the rows, 30% more production, in the same space with the same light budget. Now, if you don't want to invest $1 million in a high-tech greenhouse like that, just use rolling benches. That's a good alternative. You can huddle all of your plants together on rolling benches when the lights are on, and then if you need space, you just open up an aisle. I've gone into greenhouses where I can take one finger and open up the whole aisle and go through it so I can get to every single plant in that greenhouse. Then close it back up, open the next aisle, work on the next row. Maximize your space, maximize your light budget, and maximize your yield. So now let's look at some of the choices that we have for horticultural lighting if we're going to start to do light recipes and develop them for our own environment and our own crops. During the early germination stage, if you're going to root cuttings or if you're going to germinate seeds, you don't need a whole lot of light. In fact, the larger tropical seeds, they have enough stored carbohydrates and minerals, they can germinate in the dark. Some of the smaller seeds, though, like the lettuce and the spinach, they won't even germinate unless they get some light. But they don't need much, just a small amount of light. You can just use fluorescent lights for that. And I like to use, again, the full spectrum, even fluorescent lights. If I only had to choose one, though, I would choose the cool white fluorescents. Why? They have plenty of blue. Keeps the plant from stretching. We don't want tall, spindly plants early on. That affects the whole growth of the plant. So right from the beginning, even when the seeds first germinate, I want them to see the sky. I want them to see the light so that they don't start to stretch. So in particular, my preference is to leave the lights on 24 hours a day. Keep them just a few inches above the growing tips because they're not that intense, and then raise them as the plants grow. I also like to add a little bit of the red end of the spectrum too, though, just a small amount, because red stimulates the root development. So I want that short, stocky plant right from the beginning, but I want to encourage more lateral root growth, more root mass, so we have a sponge of roots to take up water and minerals. The more efficiently plants take up water and minerals, even from the very beginning, the more chemical reactions they do, the more sugars they can make. And some of those sugars they use for energy to grow and reproduce. So I like adding at least a little bit of the red end of the spectrum, even from the first few days after germination. As the plants start to grow and develop, they're going to need more light, though. You're going to have to go beyond just standard fluorescents. And one good choice is the T5, high output fluorescents. They are very bright. They're at least 3 to 5 times more bright than standard fluorescents, and they come in colors that you can choose from. You can choose T5 lights in the 6500 Kelvin range, that's the blue. Or you can add bulbs in the 3000 Kelvin range, that's more of the reddish. I like to mix them. So during vegetative growth stage, when I'm using my light and developing a light recipe, I'll have maybe 4 of the T5 6500 Kelvin, the blues, with 2 of the 3000 Kelvin reds. I'll put 8 bulbs over about a 4 foot by 4 foot area and keep them just a foot above the growing tips. There'll be more intensity. So we can start to spread out our plants a little so the leaves aren't overlapping, but have a good full spectrum light. Now there were some tests years ago where they were comparing metal halide lights with the T5s. They were doing side-by-side tests. They said, well, over here on one side they had 1,000-watt metal halide. Metal halide lights, full spectrum, but strong in the blue. Great for veg, right? And the next one over, they had the T5 bulbs, 420 watts. And they claimed in the test that they were about equal. Well, it really wasn't a fair test. Look at the data. If you're looking into buying lights, don't just look at the hype from the advertising. Look a little bit closer at how that data was generated. In that test, early on, they had the 1,000-watt metal halide light, but it was 3 feet above the growing tips to keep it from burning the plant. That's 1/9 the light of it, 1 foot. The T5 lights were 6 inches to a foot away. Now I have done some fair tests with both metal halide and T5s at the same wattage, and in that case, I couldn't see the difference. It was the same density, the same colors, the same general growth habit. So look beyond just the advertising hype when you're choosing your lights. When the plant gets closer to transition, I like to increase the intensity again. Remember, gradual changes for the plant work best. You don't want to go from just a light, standard fluorescent light, a shop light, to 1,000-watt sodium. That's going to be a shock to the plant. You want the plant to start to get acclimated. That's why we gradually increase the intensity and acclimate the plant to the new heat. Now, one of the lamps I really like at transition is a dual arc lamp. That has a 600-watt high-pressure sodium and a 400-watt metal halide. The high-pressure sodium is stronger in the red, the far reds. The metal halide is stronger in the blues. Put the two together, you're starting to add more of a full spectrum, and you're increasing the intensity. Another reason to increase the intensity, even during vegetative growth, is it gives the plant a chance to make more sugars. It'll store them up in the tissue, and the extra sugars that the plant makes from the extra intensity of light is shipped to the roots. It's stored in the roots as starches, carbohydrates. So when the plant transitions to flower, it's going to have more stored energy in the roots. It can burn that energy to take up minerals like phosphorus and potassium. The plant takes up more phosphorus, you'll get earlier flowering and more flowering sites. So by gradually increasing the intensity of light before flowering, you'll have a faster transition from grow to bloom, and you'll be able to get a better harvest in the end. Growers still prefer the HPS lights because of the strong red end of the spectrum for flowering. But there's some new technology with the double-ended high-pressure sodiums with an extended spectrum. Not only does it have reds and far reds, but it has more of the blue, so that's good to use for the photosynthesis, photomorphogenesis, and it even has some ultraviolet. The blue into the ultraviolet part of the spectrum, that stimulates the plants to make the precursor molecules to the anthocyanins. Those are the purple pigments. So if you want to grow herbs and vegetables that have more of the purple colors, as they get further along in their growth cycle, add more blue spectrum, especially some of the UV. If you're going to grow in a greenhouse, by the way, make sure you specify UV clear coatings. Some of the standard greenhouse coverings are designed to filter out ultraviolet light because they're growing bedding plants. But if you're growing plants that have color, you want to let the blue from the sky in. You want to let some of that ultraviolet, the UVA and the UVB. The UVB is what gives you a suntan, but it also stimulates the plant to make antioxidants and vitamins and colors and aromas, as long as you're giving it the right amount at the right time, doing your light recipe. For supplemental light, one of the best choices for growers is to add LEDs, light emitting diodes. They're very, very energy efficient, and you can add specific spectrums to your light. You could add just a little bit, say, of the blue spectrum during vegetative growth. If you add a little bit extra blue, the blue stimulates the stomata to open up, to take in more CO2. So in the Netherlands, the latest research in lighting by Philips and other manufacturers are light recipes, where they're adding specific spectrums of LED light further down in the canopy to make more of the canopy photosynthetically active. They'll still use the HID lights, the metal halide, the high-pressure sodium, as their primary light source. But then they'll add a little bit of blue lower on, add a little bit more red, activates photosynthesis, opens stomata, get higher yields with a lower energy budget. So if you're experimenting with light recipes, you can add more blue for vegetative growth, more reds, and even far reds for fruiting and flowering. And here's one of the research advances that I've seen in recent days, adding far reds. Remember, plants measure their age from dusk to dusk, from far red to far red as they develop that circadian rhythm. Well, some of the research being done now is add a flash of the far red lights, like simulating the sunset at the very end of the light cycle. If you do, the phytochrome goes from the active state to the inactive state. In other words, that flash of far reds puts the plant to sleep. And plants, to stimulate flowering, are dependent on photoperiod, the night length. And different strains have different critical dark periods. Now, if you can put the plant to sleep earlier, you can wake them up earlier in the morning. If you just went to dark, the plant will still go to sleep. It'll go into the inactive mode, but it takes 2 or 3 hours. But if you give it a flash of far reds, it goes to sleep immediately. You can wake it up earlier. You can have a longer day for the plant to do more photosynthesis, but simulate a short night to stimulate more flowering. So that is one way to get more yield in the same period of time, just by manipulating the spectrum of light. I hope you learned something today about light recipes, and I hope to see you in future classes.